Thank you, everybody, for joining this afternoon. We look forward to speaking to you in regards to migrating from ADFS to Azure Active Directory. So thank you for taking the time to join us. So we'll first look at the ADFS capabilities and compare it to what Azure AD has in comparison. So as we look side by side between Active Directory Federation Services and Azure AD, you're going to notice a feature parity between the two environments. So you're going to notice that both of them have different capabilities. They both have SSO capabilities. They both have different protection capabilities. They have alternate ID capabilities. They both have a ability to do certificate-based authentication. Now, where the biggest difference between the two environments is ADFS is really a secure token service, versus Azure Active Directory is a full-blown identity and access management solution. So it offers a lot of different capabilities outside of what ADFS can offer. So things like identity protection, things like identity governance, application provisioning, no more dependency on on-prem. So you're able to mitigate on-premise outages as it's all the infrastructure is controlled by Microsoft within Azure Active Directory. Things like conditional access, just to kind of name a few. We'll talk about a lot of these capabilities. We'll also be talking about things like passwordless and other capabilities like entitlement management as we move forward. So this table kind of presents you a view of looking at the different capabilities and what ADFS offers and Azure AD offers in their environment. So as we move ahead, let's talk about some of the technical benefits of moving to Azure Active Directory. So simplifying identity management, you have access to a wide range of applications and services. Advanced security, this is something we're going to talk a lot about. There's a lot of advanced security mechanisms available with Azure Active Directory that you don't get with ADFS. With ADFS, you get some security benefits like the password lockout and the smart lockout, as we saw earlier, but you don't get a lot of the extra benefits of things like conditional access, things like identity protection, different types of password policies that are available, just to kind of name a few, and additional things as far as when it comes to security. Scalability with Azure AD, reduced infrastructure costs. So that's a big one, because when you no longer have an on-premise presence, you're able to reduce a lot of those costs. You don't have to manage the infrastructure. That's a big, big savings there. You don't have to worry about all that. And we'll kind of talk about that shortly as far as reduction on infrastructure costs. Protecting access to all your applications. We talked about conditional access. Securing and verifying all your identities. Providing only the access necessary. Control access and detect risk, and a lot of mechanisms to alert and monitor. These are all of the major technical benefits of moving to Azure Active Directory. A lot of these capabilities you don't have with ADFS. It's all, you have to manage all of this, and it's very limited as far as what ADFS can do versus moving to Azure Active Directory. Now, looking at some of the complexities of the ADFS environment, here we have a typical ADFS environment. As you can see, you have partners, vendors, and suppliers. You have your ADFS farm. And I'll kind of open the pointer here to kind of show you some of the, as I talk through some of these items. You have your ADFS internal servers. We have your external servers in the DMZ. You have to set up a network load balancer. You have your firewall. Then you have all your SaaS applications below, which are connecting to your ADFS environment. You have your line of business applications, and then obviously you have your Active Directory providing the directory services and authentication. And then here we have Azure AD Connect, which is syncing to Azure Active Directory, which, as you can see, has SharePoint Online, OneDrive, all your Office apps, Exchange Online, and things like that. So this kind of shows you all the different intricacies with having an ADFS environment. Now we look at some of the things we have to control within each of the different layers and components. So as we see, there's the aspect of user provisioning. There's the aspects of usage metrics and auditing. There's governance. So if you look at this chart, you'll see that you have to control these aspects across the different types of application separately. So what we mean by that is if you look at your SaaS application, you have to manage your user provisioning, your metrics and auditing, your governance, all within the actual SaaS application separately. If you look at your line of business apps, you have to perform the same capabilities. You have to worry about the user provisioning. How am I going to provision users into those line of business applications? How am I going to control the auditing, the usage metrics? Who's using the applications? The governance, that's a big area. Identity governance is huge. You want to control who has access to what. You have to control all those directly within the actual applications themselves. If you look at partners, vendors, suppliers, if you have external partners, you have to control the governance. When the account, you have to create the account. When was the account created? When did the external partner leave the organization? When do I need to disable their account? So all of that has to be managed separately, as you can see. You also have to monitor you have to control the monitoring of your ADFS farm, making sure your infrastructure is up at all times, making sure there's no issues with any single servers, making sure your web application proxies are running. You have to control your certificates, right? You have to make sure that the certificate life cycle didn't expire. And if it does expire and you renew it, you have to notify all your relaying party trust that you have a new certificate. So all of that has to be managed and controlled by the admins of your organization. Now, moving to Azure Active Directory, you eliminate a lot of that by standardizing and by bringing it all into Azure Active Directory. So once you integrate all your applications into Azure Active Directory, you're able to control the user provisioning, the governance, the usage metrics, and auditing across all your apps, across all your line of business apps, across all your SaaS applications, your partners and vendors. And we'll talk about Azure B2B collaboration. You control all of that within Azure Active Directory. So you have a single pane where you control all of those capabilities. And we'll talk about some of these when it comes to provisioning, when it comes to identity governance, some of the metrics and auditing capabilities. We'll talk about it further, but we want to portray and articulate that point to show you some of the intricacies with running ADFS versus Azure Active Directory. Now, one of the major benefits, and we kind of talked about it, is getting a consistent single sign-on across all your applications. Now, we have here your Active Directory, which is currently synced with Azure AD Connect into Azure Active Directory. And then you have your external identities, your HR systems, which can provision directly into Azure Active Directory. And then here you have all your SaaS applications. You have your cloud-hosted apps. So some of the popular ones like Salesforce, work at Meta, things like that, Zoom potentially. You have your cloud-hosted apps, things like your Azure, if you have AWS, GCP, and also your line of business applications. Some of the apps that could be legacy on-premise apps. Now, those are not natively supported in Azure Active Directory, so they do require additional configuration. So things like installing and enabling an Azure App Proxy, and secure hybrid access with some of the firewall vendors, as you can see below. Assuming that those integration is set up and configured, you're able to integrate all of your applications directly to Azure AD and have a single sign-on experience across all of your apps. So once you enable, say, passwordless logon experience, and we'll talk about that, and we have a demo to show you how that works. So they're able to get a passwordless, seamless sign-on experience across all of these array of applications without necessarily having a different experience where they log into one app different way versus logging into a different app. Along with your external identities, being able to provision them directly into Azure AD and have that capability. So just kind of wanted to articulate that point here. And we'll talk about password hashing and syncing your on-premise passwords directly into Azure Active Directory. Now, we talked earlier about conditional access. So conditional access allows you to control the authentication, and we'll kind of walk you through a user experience and what that looks like. So we first start off here with the different sources. So as you can see, a user can log in from any one of these sources, right? So they can come in from a Mac OS device, from a Windows device. They can be coming in with a different type of identity. They can be coming from a different location. So these are all the different sources, as you can see here, when they're signing in. So once they sign in, these are all the conditions, right? So Azure Active Directory sees all of that, sees what type of user you are, what type of role do you have, right? It sees the location you're coming from. It sees things like if you're coming from a trusted or compliant device. It sees what type of authentication method you're using to log in and what type of client app you're using. So these are all the conditions. So as you come into Azure Active Directory, conditional access looks at that based off of the conditions and based on what it sees and the policies you configure, of course. it has different layers of control. So it's able to say, based off of that, I'm going to put in controls to secure that logon. So I'm either going to allow you access, I'm going to block access, I'm going to require additional or adaptive MFA, right? So you might have a policy that enforces MFA across all your logon, regardless where you're coming from, enforce MFA. Or you might say, if you're coming from a specific network location, that's a trusted IP for our office, I want to allow access without MFA. That's just one example. Or there's specific conditions where you want to outright block access. And you can specify this across all your different apps, and you can have separate policies for your different cloud apps, for your on-premise apps. Some you might be more secure than others, so you can, of course, control all of that through conditional access. You can control the type of authentication. You can control things like forcing only passwordless logon, as an example. So there's a lot of different mechanisms and controls and capabilities available with conditional access. We use it for a lot of different capabilities within our organization, to things like enforcing MFA on all logons, as an example. And you might also have different policies for your guest and external users, right? That's going to differ from your internal users. So all of that can be controlled through conditional access. So here we'll show you a demo of what conditional access looks like. So essentially here we have a user who's logging in normally to their environment. They enter their credentials, as you can see, and they enter their password. Once they get enforced MFA, so we have a conditional access policy, as you can see here, that enforced MFA on this user. The user got a prompt, and they have the Authenticator app. They accept it on their phone, and they went ahead and they logged in directly. And after they're logged in, they access the Atlassian Cloud app. That's an app that we integrated, a third-party app. And as you can see, they're able to log in without a problem. Here, they're logging in from a network location. Now, here are users trying to attempt to log on again, but this time they're logging in from a non-network location. So they're logging in from a different IP address that is not on the network. So they're logging in same way. They log in. Normally, they get enforced MFA because our conditional access policy enforced MFA on all logons. So regardless where they're logging in from, they were enforced MFA. Now you'll see a big difference. So after they log in, they again log into their main portal. Then they go to their My Apps portal because they want to access their different applications. So the user typed in, and we'll show you the My Apps portal shortly, what that experience looks like and what they can access. So then they attempted to again log into Atlassian Cloud off network, and they got blocked because it said you're not in a proper network location, and it restricted that access. So in this example, as you guys saw, user logged in. I had a conditional access policy that said when they're logging into this specific Atlassian Cloud app, they have to come in from a network IP. If they're coming from a not-network IP, I restricted the access. So this is just one piece of it. There's a lot more configuration that can be done, but we wanted to show you and articulate what conditional access looks like in real time for the end user. Now, we also talked about B2B collaboration and collaborating with external partners. So when you have an on-premise environment, you have to kind of, as an admin, control all these capabilities. You have to be able to control and create accounts for all your external partners as they're coming into your environment. You have to create the account, you have to enable it, and then they have to come in and then access what they need to do. And then when they leave the organization, you have to go in and actually disable the account. You have to reach out to find out if they're part of the organization. Now, what you could do with Azure Active Directory with Azure B2B collaboration is automate that entire process. So what happens is you invite an external partner to, say, a team channel that you have that you want to collaborate with. You send them an invite, they accept the invite, and it automatically creates a stub account in your environment. They authenticate with their credentials in their Azure AD organization. Once they authenticate and they log in, they leverage the guest account that was automatically created and log into your environment without you as an admin having to really do anything on that. Now, we showed earlier about conditional access. You as an administrator can control what type of authentication you want to enforce. You can also trust, say, if your policy enforces MFA, you can trust if the organization they're coming from also forces multi-factor authentication, you as an admin can trust that multi-factor that they performed in their organization and allow them to log in without doing a separate multi-factor. But you could control that all with conditional access policies, as we saw earlier. Now, the important point to point out with Azure B2B collaboration, this is something that's going to really help with the onboarding and offboarding, is that the authentication is occurring in the home directory. So let's say that that user, after collaborating with your organization a month later, they're no longer with their organization. Now, the great part is that the authentication occurred in their home organization, so they will no longer be able to collaborate within your organization because their actual account is disabled in their organization. So when you have on-premises, that's not the case because you have to get notified that, hey, you have to go and disable this account. You have to control that. Azure B2B collaboration eliminates that, and it automates that process and allows you to kind of streamline that onboarding and offboarding, because I find that they're both important. Onboarding is important, but also offboarding correctly is just as important, because you want to make sure that people don't have access after they're no longer with an organization. Now, we talked earlier about passwordless. That's another beautiful part of Azure Active Directory, is being able to have a passwordless experience for your end users. So leveraging the Authenticator app on your phone to have a passwordless experience. So user puts in their username, and after they enter their username, instead of getting the normal prompt that enter your password, instead they get a prompt that they authenticate on their phone. And we'll show you a demo shortly on how exactly that looks for the end user. Now, this, of course, does require the end user to perform configuration on their device, and there's some change management involved. And we could talk about that as it's required in further conversations. But it does require some change management as far as getting users used to that fact, but they're able to have that streamlined passwordless experience using the Authenticator app, or potentially a phishing resistant authentication method like a FIDO2 security key. So this kind of gives you that beautiful passwordless experience. I personally use that in a lot of different, I log into a lot of different tenants, including our home Ravanty tenant and other demo tenants that we have, and other partner organizations that we collaborate with. So having that passwordless experience is great because I don't need to set, and a lot of times you end up setting the same password across different organizations anyway. So it kind of eliminates some of the security barriers. And also this is phishing resistant too in a lot of ways, because, you know, even if your password, somebody has the password, they really wouldn't be able to essentially kind of log in. You have that seamless experience using passwordless. So I love it. I use it daily, and it eliminates me having to remember all these passwords. So I'll kind of show you a demo here of the passwordless sign-on experience. The first screen you're seeing here is me actually logging in into the environment, and I'm logging in with just my username. I enter my username as I normally would in my login experience, and then instead of it prompting me for a password, it just prompts me to approve the sign-in. So on a separate, and I'll show you the experience on the mobile device as well. I got the notification on my mobile phone saying, hey, go ahead and approve this sign-in. After I approved the sign-in, as you can see, it bypassed that screen without me having to do anything else. This is something that says, do you want to stay signed in? And it signed me in normally into my environment. Now here, I'll show you what that looks like on the phone. So I got that notification on my phone. As you can see, the code was 10. Now this code matching is new. It's to protect MFA fatigue, meaning instead of you just getting a notification saying approve the sign-in, you actually have to match the codes. So as you saw, I entered code 10. I entered code 10 here. I said, yes, it's me. It allowed me to log in, and I completed the full passwordless experience. Alrighty, so we talked a lot about Azure Active Directory and some of the great benefits and the security benefits. So now we're going to look at some of the ADFS insights you can get from Azure Active Directory. Now, there's this beautiful tool called the Azure Active Directory Connect Health for ADFS. It's an agent that gets installed on all your ADFS servers and your web application proxies, and it brings together a lot of different components. So it allows you to get alerts about your ADFS environment. So to understand if there's any OS upgrades, if there's any issues occurring within your ADFS servers, It gives you details on usage and insights about your ADFS, who's using what application, how heavy is this usage, what network locations are the users using them from. So a lot of insights and usage analytics on your different relaying party trusts in your ADFS environment. Performance monitoring, so it gives you details about your ADFS environment, whether your ADFS environment is underutilized or overutilized. So it gives you some of the performance metrics and brings in the reporting capabilities to kind of show you some of that ongoing activity. Now here you'll see some of the usage and analytics. So you see a lot of different things here. You see like the total number of requests. You're seeing your different relaying party trusts. Why we find this is important, because you might ask yourself, well, I don't really know about my ADFS environment. Before I move my ADFS to Azure Active Directory, at least I want to have some insights and information, because I can't just take it and move it, right? I have to understand, well, how is my ADFS being used? Which relaying party trusts are being used, right? What's the usage percentage? Maybe I find that, as you can see, there's an app here that's barely being used, right? It's used by, 0.5% of my logons are used that, of my usage is that app. So it's not really being heavily used. So maybe I don't want to move it, or maybe I didn't even know that that app is being used, and maybe that's a legacy app that I no longer want to use, right? So you're grouping all your metrics and you see all your requests and your different types of requests, who's authenticating, which ones are heavily used. So at least it gives you some of that insights and auditing capabilities, all within the Azure Active Directory side, leveraging that agent we talked about earlier. So it kind of gives you that information so you can use that when you're making the decision on what applications to move, how to move it. So at least you have that comfort level of and that visibility in your ADFS environment that natively within ADFS you do not get. You get some auditing, you get some things where you can go into audit logs locally in Windows and look at some of these, but it's not organized, it's not grouped, it's not parsed the way this is. So this analytics we find is very important and an important part of installing that agent to get this visibility. Now, another thing you get is a risky IP report. This is big because you want to understand what types of bad logons are occurring, right? One of the biggest benefits of moving away from ADFS into Azure Active Directory is gaining the security benefits. You no longer have to have your ADFS exposed. You don't have there's been a lot of reports out there of ADFS being exposed because it doesn't have the strongest security mechanisms in place. There's a few smart lockout capabilities, and there's certain things you can do to control it on the firewall level, but overall, you don't have all the security benefits and the capabilities that you have within Azure Active Directory. So here you can get some insights on like bad password attempts. You can understand if there's someone's laptop device that's constantly sending authentication traffic to your ADFS environment. You see some insights, and you also see if there's bad password attempts, right? You might see that this random IP address and some random location is constantly making phishing your environment, entering username, and trying all types of passwords. So at least you gain some visibility into that. It's not a way of scaring, you and trying to present something, but at least it gives you some visibility and comfort to at least get those insights and get that information about your environment. Now, we ask ourselves, so we talked about app migration, we talked about authentication. So what comes first, right? App migration or authentication? So there is some dependency, but there's no direct dependency on one another. So you could kind of control which ones to move. And we'll talk about what we mean by app migration. We'll talk about moving your authentication, because to kind of summarize this point, there's two layers, right? So you have to first move your authentication. You have to move your authentication to Azure Active Directory, and then also you move your apps. So the applications that are integrated with ADFS, those have to move directly to integrate with Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory performs the authentication and single sign-on for those apps, and then your users are authenticating directly to Azure Active Directory. So we'll kind of talk about what that means. We'll talk about the considerations, what to move, which apps to move first, what capabilities you have with the different apps, we'll talk about things like the app gallery and what apps are available to kind of ease that transition for you into Azure Active Directory. So usually starts like this in a typical ADFS environment. We have your Active Directory, we have your ADFS environment. Here below, we have our users, right? We have our users who are logging into our ADFS environment. We have our different SaaS applications here that are integrated directly with our ADFS environment. And we have our normal ADFS logon page. When users go to Azure Active Directory, they enter their username. It redirects them back to ADFS. They authenticate on the screen, and then it passes them back to Azure Active Directory, and they log on to their Office 365 applications. So it usually starts like this. Then we migrate some of the apps. So here we migrated a few of the apps directly into Azure Active Directory. So meaning Azure, it's no longer tied to ADFS. So user logs in normally. Again, in this scenario, the user is still authenticating to ADFS. After they log in, besides logging into Office 365, they can also log into like Salesforce and Workday without these applications being dependent on your ADFS, because they're now single sign-on directly to Azure AD. Now, here we move some users is what's called a stage rollout, and we'll talk about what that means. Basically, you move a pilot set of users, you move their authentication to Azure Active Directory. So if this user here logs into Azure Active Directory, instead of being passed to your ADFS and seeing your ADFS logon, they log in directly to Azure AD. Once they log in, and then they get access to the different applications, and they're no longer dependent on the ADFS logon experience. Here, we migrate some more of the apps, right? We move some more of the apps, we move more of the users into Azure Active Directory as part of the stage rollout. Here we had a few, right? And here we move some more apps, so you're piloting with more users into directly authenticating to Azure AD. And then we take care of your other apps. So we move all your other apps into Azure Active Directory. We set up single sign-on. So like Workday, Salesforce, and all your other apps are all moving their single sign-on experience directly to Azure AD. As you can see, there's very little or no dependency now on your ADFS. Why? Because your users are all pretty much authenticating directly to Azure AD. Your applications are single sign-on to Azure AD. So what that means is the user logs in with their username and password. If there's any conditional access policy, other things that were implemented, they log in and then they access all their apps. Now, once everything is moved, we saw earlier that Slack was left. So we moved that too. We took care of everything. Now we confirm that there's no more activity on your ADFS environment. Everything's moved. Your users are moved. Their authentication, all your apps are moved. Now there's no more dependency on your ADFS. Now you can remove your ADFS endpoints publicly. You can remove your WAP servers, and your ADFS is no longer exposed externally, and it's no longer part of your environment. Now you can proceed with safely decommissioning and removing the ADFS from your environment. That's something important to know. Just because you moved your authentication, just because you moved single sign-on and all your apps away from ADFS, doesn't necessarily mean you're entirely through. You want to make sure you properly decommission your ADFS environment so it's no longer exposed and not part of your environment, because even though nothing's pointing to it, if it's still exposed and if it's still active, people can still technically, bad actors can attempt to authenticate against it. So that's an important point and call out. Now, some app migration considerations we want to kind of talk about. So the first step as far as knowing what apps to move is the discovery process. This is where we look at all your different types of applications that are integrated with your ADFS. We first look at all your third-party apps and we'll talk about what the Azure App Gallery and what that means. So we first want to look at all your third-party apps and look at if they're available in the Azure Active App Gallery. So these are pre-configured apps that Microsoft already configured. There's a template and configuration for. All you have to do is change the variables tied to your tenant and your environment, and you freely integrate those apps directly with Azure Active Directory. Now, the second set of apps can be third-party SaaS apps that don't have an integration potentially. So they're not in the app gallery today. Now, Microsoft is updating the app gallery pretty much on a weekly basis as new apps are coming out. as new integrations or new requests are coming out, they're trying to add more and more into the app gallery to make it easier, to make that transition easier. So we work on adding those apps as well. So there's links and documentation on a lot of the different apps. Vendors have different apps on doing things like SAML integration that you can get and ease that transition for these apps. You also have some of your federated apps, and you have some of your legacy apps, things that are, they're not third-party apps. These do require extra configuration, so they require setting up an Azure App Proxy or secure hybrid access in order to integrate them. So those would kind of come in at the end because they do require some additional configuration. Now, sorry to jump ahead. So a couple of tools, there's some tools available to get some insights. So the Azure AD Connect Help we talked about earlier does an inventory of all your applications. So it presents you, and we'll look at what that looks like in the next page. Presents you an inventory of all your applications that are available in your ADFS environment. It gives you some metrics on who's using it, how many users are using those apps, and also gives you a migration status. Why that's important? Because Microsoft has done some homework to know which of these apps are already supported and can be freely moved to Azure Active Directory, which of the apps can be moved with some additional configuration, and there's some warnings, meaning this you have a claim rule which can't be moved and has to be reconfigured, or some apps that are not supported at all or require like as we talked about, the app proxy or secure hybrid access. So it gives you some of that insight, so you as an admin at least have some information and can tell which apps I should move and which apps require some additional configuration. And then there's the migration readiness script, which is kind of an offline script that you can run. It gives you like a spreadsheet view of your apps and gives you a status instead of having it within the Azure Active Directory. There's some licensing consideration as far as using the Azure AD Connect Help for ADFS, and we can talk about that further as it's required. Now, this we looked at the activity report, so this is kind of more of a close-up. So it shows you all your applications, shows you the user counts and how many users are using the different apps and their migration status. And as we talked about earlier, so this is more of a close-up, and migration tests have been done to confirm whether or not these apps are supported, which ones are not. So it gives you some insights on your different apps. Now, we talked about earlier about the app gallery. This is amazing because Microsoft has an application gallery with hundreds of apps and thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of apps that it was hundreds, it started slow, and then as the time went on, naturally grew to the thousands, and more apps are being integrated. So that number is growing pretty much, like I said, on a weekly basis. But they created a lot of different configuration and templates for a lot of different major SaaS applications. So it makes the transition of that app a lot easier. So let's take as an example, we'll take Salesforce, right? You add the Salesforce app directly, and there's a link in documentation and exactly what URLs or what you have to configure within each of the apps. So you add the app directly, you set up the configuration, you set up the different URLs for that app, and then you reach out to the app. You get the URLs from Azure AD, you input them. Once you do that, you configure it, you test the logon, and now you have that app integrated. So it makes it a lot easier. You just provide the certificate from Azure AD, which is controlled by Microsoft on that end, so you don't have to manage the certificates as we saw earlier. Once that's done, you integrated it, then you could go about provisioning, which we'll talk about, assigning the application and different things. Now, you might wonder which apps go first, right? Well, which one should I move? So you want to first move any SaaS application, things that are already in the gallery, things that are easy to move, that have predefined templates. Let's move those. Apps that support IDP connections naturally. So you want to make sure that they support an external IDP and making sure that they support Azure AD as an IDP. So that's obviously important. Apps that you have a test instance for. Why that's important? Because if you have a test instance, you can validate the federation and single sign-on with the test instance before you move the prod instance. You want to look at apps with simple claim rules, apps that you don't have any major custom claim rules that you have to reconfigure. So like things that have like network claim rules where you're control, like you want to control which IPs they connect from, things like that, right? Things that have simple claim rules, or I only allow access if they're coming from this department, things along those lines, right? Things with a controlled audience. So you want to move apps that you know who has access to those apps and things like that. So you want to use those types of considerations when you're looking at, okay, which apps should I move first? Now, we talked earlier about provisioning. This is something that ADFS you don't get. You have to worry, provisioning will rely on manual. So manual interactions, you have to have signups, you have to have just-in-time provisioning where they log in and it provisions them, which has a lot of limitations. CSV uploads, you have to have scripts, you have to run a MIM, on-prem MIM system in order the Microsoft Identity Manager to provision the users across all the different applications. So there's a lot of manual intervention. So with Azure AD provisioning, using the Azure AD provisioning service, you can automate a lot of that using the SCIM provisioning model. So there's exposed APIs to allow Azure AD to provision the users in the target environment. Along with onboarding and provisioning them, it also allows to offboard them and delete them when they're disassigned the application, and also make updates and changes. So if somebody changes department, if you want to pass certain group claims, meaning like if they're in this marketing group and you want to pass that to the target application. So as an example, like Tableau as one app that relies heavily on that. So let's say you need to pass that as part of your claim, you can do that with Azure AD provisioning services. So it handles the provisioning and, just as importantly, the deprovisioning, updates and changes. So you kind of automate that flow and automate that process. Now, earlier I showed you in the demo when we were logging in, I had the My Apps portal. So the My Apps portal is a web-based portal that users can log in and have a single pane of glass and see all of their applications that are configured for them. Now, they only see what they can actually access. So if I don't have access in this example to Box, right, I won't see that Box application and get it, because then that's going to cause confusion. If every user sees every app, then they're going to try to click on things, get errors. So they only see what they can, and you can organize them by group here using what's called app launchers. So you configure these different categories of apps. You can customize the name, you can customize who sees which apps. So in this case, you have marketing, HR, on-prem, security, and things like that. Now, here I'll show you a demo of a user logging into their My Apps portal. So they go to myapps.microsoft.com. They log in normally. So we have a user here who's logging in. This user is a staff user who has access to a certain subset of apps. So they log in normally, like they normally would. After the user is logged in successfully, and of course, depending on your conditional access policy enforcing MFA, and depending on what you enforce, after they're logged in, then they saw their My Apps portal. They click on their different apps. So they clicked on Word and they brought them to the Word application. So say you want to access email and collab category of apps, you click on Outlook and it launches Outlook for you from there, and you're able to access it from there. Now you also can categorize your different apps. So in this case, the user clicked on SharePoint, OneDrive, whatever application that they needed access to. They don't need to remember, oh, how do I get to my OneDrive? How do I get to... Now you also have on the left side, you have a waffle there with some of the shortcuts to some of those links. But where this is important, of course, is you're categorizing these apps for them. Instead of just seeing all your apps, you can categorize them best in an app launcher. So it makes it easier for your users to access them. And then they're able to kind of get access to their apps and also their third-party apps. As you can see, we have the third-party app section where the user clicks on it, and you'll see that now. In this case, I have Atlassian Cloud Federated, so they clicked on it and they successfully logged in and they got access to all their apps. So it makes it easier. It opens all the tabs for the different apps, so you're able to navigate across all your apps using the beautiful My Apps portal. Alrighty, so now earlier we talked about identity governance. So I wanted to touch on this. We find this is very, very important. Entitlement management allows you to automate the process of assigning and disassigning resources to your different team members. So one of the beautiful benefits of leveraging and using entitlement management is you create these things called access packages. You add all your resources into an access package, and then you release that access package to allow users either to request them, and as they request them, you can have approvals. You can automatically assign the access packages. So let's say you created a marketing package that you said if a user's department equals marketing, they automatically get access to this access package, which gives them access to these applications, these SharePoint sites, or these Teams channels. So you automate that entire process. Or in some cases, you want to have users request it so they could go in and see which packages they have, and they can request access to them. And then you have the different life cycles, could control how long they have access for. And also you can have access reviews. So they have to basically, let's say every 30 days, renew their access, recertify themselves and say, hey, do you still need access? And if they say, no, I don't, it automatically removes them from that access package, which in turn automatically removes them permission from those different resources which are provisioned. So this is a beautiful new component of Azure Active Directory as part of their identity governance suite of products. So it allows you to automate that, and this reduces a lot of the manual intervention involved with assigning, resources. Eliminates users from having to create tickets, and user logs in day one, they have access to what they need. And you, as an admin, you can see you have auditing, you have controls to see who has access to what. So. Also, we want to look at some, we talked earlier about app migration. Now we want to look at authentication and some of the considerations when it comes to that. So the first thing is you want to align all your users' passwords, right, into Azure Active Directory. So as you move away from ADFS into Azure Active Directory, you might ask yourself, well, users have a specific password that they have in AD. How do I transition that so that they don't have to set new passwords in Azure AD? I know earlier we talked about passwordless and the benefits, so users don't have to have passwords anymore, but that takes time naturally. That might not happen day one because there's a change management window, there's a window of users having to add the authentication app. So password hash synchronization eliminates that barrier. You enable this as part of Azure AD Connect. It syncs your hashed password. It's not in plain text, so it hashes it a few times. It salts it before it sends it to Azure AD. Azure AD does not have your password, does not know about it. And it sends that to Azure AD. And then you have that consistent sign-in experience. So user day one, when they're logging in, they log in with their same username and same password. And we'll talk about it in about the leaked credential reports. So as Azure AD has your passwords, they're able to take those passwords and look in the dark web to see if their passwords are exposed somehow. They look at like law enforcement agencies and dark web locations and other places where people post public passwords and information. So it allows them to check that password hash to see if somebody else has that password listed and provide you notifications and things to say, hey, you have all these passwords that are potentially exposed, and it gives you some insights on that. So password hash sync allows you to have that capability. Now, there's also another layer of pass-through authentication. This is where you set up an agent where Azure AD, as a user enters their password, reaches out to Active Directory and says, hey, validate whether this password is active or not. It doesn't actually have the password hash. It passes that through the pass-through authentication. There's an agent that has an outbound connection only, and they verify if the password is good, and then they log in. Now, this still requires you to have an agent, requires you to have on-premise presence. We don't generally recommend it because the whole purpose is to get away from having any on-prem dependencies. But if there's any regulatory requirements where you can't sync passwords to Azure AD, this is an option that's available. There's also seamless sign-on experience without ADFS, where it's enabled through Azure Active Directory. It allows you to get a seamless sign-on experience when you're logging into your different applications based on your logged in credentials onto your machine. Now, This is for non-Azure AD joined devices. Azure AD joined devices already have this capability without needing the seamless sign-on experience, but this is for Active Directory joined machines. We won't talk about this in this webinar and subsequent ones. We might talk about further about Intune and being able to have Azure AD joined machines. But for non-Azure AD joined machines and for domain joined machines, this is the single sign-on experience, so users don't have to log in to the MyOps portal as you saw. They seamlessly sign in based on their credentials that they're logged in with their on their Active Directory joined device. There's also certificate-based authentication. If there's any organizations out there that require certificate-based authentication, that's now supported natively in Azure AD. So you're able to configure that and allow sign-in using a certificate directly into Azure Active Directory. It's set up with it's phishing-resistant certificate-based authentication. So you're able to set that up natively in Azure Active Directory, of course, as it's required if your organization has that requirement that's available natively in Azure Active Directory. Now, we talked earlier about stage rollout. Stage rollout basically allows you to move certain subset of users to leverage Azure AD authentication natively, migrates them away from ADFS. So you're able to control that. You create a group. As you can see here, it's done through the Azure AD Connect in the portal.azure.com. After you go to Azure Active Directory, you go to enable stage rollout, you create a group, you add the users to that group. The next time, it takes some time for application, but the next time, the user logs in, they enter their username, they're no longer past ADFS, they log in directly with Azure Active Directory. So this is perfect to test the authentication experience, to test your conditional access policies, to validate how it's working. You might move some IT members and some champion users, right? You want to sometimes not necessarily only move IT because IT is able to troubleshoot some things that come out, but also some champion users, you want to move them too. So they see that experience, they can pass that experience to some of their colleagues and team members, and you kind of get a better audience and better picture of how things look before you move everybody else over and implement different policies across Azure Active Directory. There's also similar SSPR, self-service password reset capabilities. Again, if you go with passwordless and you no longer have a password dependency, it doesn't become as important, but in the interim, you have single sign, you can enable self-service password reset, where users, if they have a second form of authentication configured, of course, they can enter their username, they can authenticate on their phone using the Authenticator app, as I showed earlier, and then they're able to reset their password. And if you have an Active Directory presence, it'll rewrite that password back to Active Directory, which will directly, as part of password hashing, sync it back to Azure Active Directory. So it eliminates, help desk calls and reaching out to help desk to, reset my password. You can do that natively in Azure Active Directory. And you can enable password policies. So you can have a banned password list. So if users set password, they don't set things like password 1, department 1, generic passwords. You can set that up and enforce it. And then you can also enforce it across your on-prem environment for your any on-prem accounts, things like that for your Windows servers, and you have some admin accounts, things you can do that as well. So you have that capability to have those password protection and revoke it, how long the passwords are good for, things like that. You have that password protection capabilities in Azure Active Directory. Alrighty, that concludes my portion. Thank you, everybody, again. I hope this was insightful for everybody as we talked about moving from on-prem ADFS to Azure Active Directory, all the different capabilities. I'll now pass it on to my colleague, Roman, who will talk about some of the additional components, some business benefits, and some other benefits of moving to Azure Active Directory. So, Roman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yesai, for a great overview. It was very informative, and hopefully everyone finds something new and interesting for their environment as well. And I really just wanted to kind of summarize some of the aspects of, the benefits of consolidation and bringing identity processes and applications into Azure Active Directory. really increasing the productivity is one of the important components within the organization. Obviously, creating streamlined identity and access management processes not only helps users, but also helps administrators as it pertains to, you know, delegation and having a little bit better controls around things like privileged identity management components, and really increasing the efficiency for admins as well, while using single identity across cloud and on-premises assets, and really creating better collaboration experience, as well as better processes when organizations work with, you know, vendors, external partners, what have you. Obviously, managing risk is a big component in all this context, as it pertains to providing better visibility mechanisms around security and compliance within the organization, and really assisting businesses with things like understanding the landscape around unknown applications, SaaS-based unknown applications that may be used by users within the organization, which is very common scenario that we've seen in different industry verticals, and really providing that peace of mind for admins to kind of stop worrying about those scenarios within the organization, and providing some automated mechanisms as well. All this obviously results in managing cost. Yeah, if we can go back for a moment, thank you. All this results in managing cost and really providing some new ways to potentially save on costs within the organization, be it by consolidation of those assets and reducing the dependency and footprint on premises, and really helping, our mantra is really helping organizations to leverage their investments to the fullest, right? We've seen a lot of organizations already own cloud environment. They already invested in Microsoft 365 services, but they don't necessarily know all the capabilities or the power within Azure Active Directory and that everything that comes with it. And modernizing identity infrastructure is essentially a natural outcome from all these consolidation activities that take place, bringing the applications, bringing the identity processes into Azure Active Directory. And in a lot of scenarios, we've seen that businesses take advantage of that increased advanced security posture and potentially impact their cyber insurance premiums as well. And with all that, also the compliance and governance is another component that is important, really enforcing the corporate access policies and monitoring policies within the environment, while not only relying on, you know, end users and activities performed by end users, but also being able to enforce those policies and also prevent mistakes that users may be doing unintentionally in their overall identity and access management lifecycle, or even sharing data in certain scenarios. I also wanted to talk about our implementation framework. I think obviously we talked about a lot of different things, you know, application migration, authentication migration. It's important to have structured approach, and this is essentially depicts our framework around delivery process as it pertains to how we approach our projects. Really comprised of these different phases you see here, you know, ideation, where we typically align on business objectives, understand the organizational pain points and or goals that organizations trying to achieve, because every environment is different. While there are some standardized approach mechanisms that can be applied to every scenario, however, every environment can be different from the standpoint of complexity. And other phases, obviously here, discover, architect, rollout, and emerge really kind of represent the different phases of your rollout process and or migration process when you're migrating from ADFS to Azure Active Directory. Also, we talked a lot about technology. I think it's also important, very important, I would say, to talk about adoption and change management, because in scenarios like this, the end user impact is unavoidable. And that's why it's also important to not just focus on technology migration and migration of those processes, but also make sure that your users are actually prepared for the change, be it change in the access process or change in the way they now see their applications. We talked about My Apps portal, for example. Those changes need to be properly communicated, and the list here that you see really represents different pillars of adoption and change management that can be tailored for different organizations. We do provide the services. We partner with some of our great partners in the industry vertical with a vast amount of knowledge and expertise. And I can probably say that about 98% of our projects require adoption and change management because of those changes that organizations go through. And the beauty about this is that they can be tailored. And what's important here is to take into account the organization's culture and the style that they're used to going through change. Some organizations, require, for example, webinars. Others may have a specific dedicated adoption and or marketing or change management team that they would like to see a champions program, kind of helping them with more like a trainer type model and things like that. So bottom line is can be customized, but I definitely wanted to stress the importance of adoption and change management that also empowers those technological transformational projects. As it pertains to this ADFS to Azure AD migration, just to kind of touch on activities and or outcomes, really starting with that discovery that Yesai talked about of existing ADFS farm environment, discovering existing AD and Azure Active Directory presence, make sure that best practices and foundational aspects are in place before even moving forward, with application migration or putting any users in Azure Active Directory from the standpoint of accessing those applications. Discovering and classifying ADFS integrated applications, obviously we discussed that, making sure there is prioritization list, making sure that we're starting kind of slow in terms of understanding which apps are have like a high tolerance level from the standpoint of change for users and which apps are really simple to kind of migrate them first. Designing and architecting, obviously, authentication requirements, that's an important aspect, and absolutely important to test and pilot functionalities that are good candidates for a piloting process before doing full production migration or cutover processes as well. Obviously, all this kind of resulting in the outcome of decommissioning ADFS environment and having less dependency on on-premises environment as well. And from deliverable standpoint, obviously, if this is something that your organization is interested to conduct, typically these are the deliverables that we would essentially hand it over to the IT team or the team responsible for the transformation. Obviously all the diagrams and reports that are applicable to discovery processes, any type of validation that needs to take place. If you already extended your environment to cloud, you already have Microsoft 365 presence, we typically would validate what's in place and not just jump into kind of cutover processes or transformation processes. And also proposing transition plan and experience document, and kind of going back to that adoption and change management conversation, really not bringing the training component at the end of the transformation, but throughout the project, making sure that there is proper transparent communication within the organization with appropriate departments, with appropriate teams to prepare them for that cutover, and really empowering that with also identified specific success criteria matrix document, which will represent what does success mean for your organization, right? Like I said, every organization is different, and that's why that needs to be taken into account. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone for joining today. Hopefully this was helpful, and certainly looking forward to hearing from you even if you have any questions. or you're not certain how to proceed with your technological journey, if you have any scenarios like this, we'll certainly be happy to help. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to Shane.
I share the same sentiment, Roman. This was a great topic, an intense topic, and I'm sure everyone walked away with some new information around Azure AD. We did have a few questions that came in, and I'll direct it to both of you. So one that came in: can Azure AD support hybrid environments where both on-premises and cloud resources coexist? Not sure who, maybe Isai, I think this one might be good for you.
Yep, he may be on mute, or hopefully not a technical issue, but I can certainly take that as well. Certainly, Azure Active Directory does provide some robust support for hybrid environments. We've seen a lot of companies can leverage Azure AD Connect to obviously synchronize on-premises Active Directory environment with Azure Active Directory. Obviously, we talked a lot about the seamless authentication and some streamlined access management processes across on-premises and cloud resources. So, and it also ensures and assures that there is a smooth transition that allows organizations to leverage the benefits of both environments. And that's the beauty about that. When you essentially extend your on-premises environment to cloud, it's not like you're just disconnecting from on-premises environment. It basically becomes part of your infrastructure, part of your technology landscape. So with that, definitely the answer is yes, and we're certainly happy to discuss more in depth in details if there are certain scenarios, as there are many different features that are applicable to hybrid scenarios.
Great. Here's another one. How does Azure AD handle authentication protocols compared to ADFS?
And I'll take that one here. So Azure AD, like ADFS, supports a lot of SAML integration and WS-Fed, so authentication protocols there. So with Azure AD, you get more of the modern. So you're able to have SAML-based authentication, but you also have different authentication mechanisms, including SAML, including OIDC, including OpenID Connect. So a lot of different authentication protocols, more of the modern authentication protocols that are supported with Azure Active Directory in comparison to what ADFS can support. So a lot of the different modern authentication mechanisms, including SAML, including OIDC and OpenID Connect, all supported, and OAuth, of course, all supported through Azure Active Directory.
Okay, it looks like this one came in when you were talking about single sign-on. So how can Azure AD seamless single sign-on improve user experience during the migration?
Yeah, and I'll take that one as well. So depending on so there's two components to seamless sign-on. We have the domain join user, and we have the Azure AD join devices. We didn't talk a lot about Azure AD join devices, so there's a separate experience for that. So any domain join machine, we talked about earlier about seamless single sign-on. So having that enabled through Azure AD Connect essentially allows the user on a domain join machine, as they're logging into, say, their My Apps portal or portal.office.com, or however they're logging into which service, ideally going through the My Apps portal, they log in, they have that seamless sign-on experience where it automatically takes their log credentials and automatically logs them in, assuming you have seamless sign-on and something like password sync enabled as part of your authentication to Azure AD. It allows that sign-in experience to be seamless, so user doesn't have to, enter their username and password. It automatically signs them in. And similar experience for Azure AD join devices. If you have an Azure AD join devices, it reads your authenticated credentials and automatically logs you in. So different experience for domain join, non-Azure AD joined, and also Azure AD joined devices.
That's great. One more. Can you explain how Azure AD conditional access policies can enhance security during the migration specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, conditional access, we saw earlier all the controls and everything that you have in place, right? So conditional access, we saw earlier you have a source, you have conditions, and you have controls. So you could customize it to meet all of your needs and all your requirements. So you can control the pilot experience. You can control as users move their authentication, or as you move applications to Azure Active Directory, you can enable the conditional access policy to protect those applications or to protect those users, even while you're transitioning everything else into Azure Active Directory. As we saw, your sources and what you control and what conditions are being presented is what conditional access policy can control. So you can implement a policy for a specific app that you just moved. You moved this app, now you want to make sure that this app is secured before you move it over. So you create that conditional access policy to protect that app, whether you want to enforce step-up MFA or whether you want to enforce something like only allowing access to this application from this network location. You create that conditional access policy, you enable it, and then you essentially enforce users as they're using it. That conditional policy gets enforced. You can put it also in reporting only mode if you want to test it in the pilot experience. So again, there's a lot of ways to kind of customize conditional access policy to kind of meet your needs. You can do it a different way. You initially put a reporting only mode to test it and then enforce it. So fully customizable to kind of meet your needs.
Fantastic. What about what about custom internal apps relying on ADFS?
Yeah, we absolutely great question. So we saw earlier we talked about the line of business applications and applications that are not exposed publicly to the internet. You might have those directly connected to ADFS. They don't have an external presence. So those would require configuration through what's called the Azure Application Proxy, which can be installed on premises. It's an agent that allows you to integrate that app directly with Azure AD. So that agent that's installed talks to Azure AD, and through that exchange, you're essentially, without directly exposing that application to the internet, it allows you to integrate that app into Azure AD, and you add that app and you assign it to your users to have that single sign-on experience to that app. Or you can use it through third-party firewall vendors. We saw earlier through secure hybrid access, where they facilitate essentially they act like the middleman between Azure AD and the application. So it allows you to connect back to your on-premise legacy applications, even through Azure AD as they're assigned. Depending on how you assign it, whether it's through entitlement management, you assign it directly, but it allows you to have that single sign-on experience to those applications as well through those mechanisms we talked about, which was the Azure App Proxy or secure hybrid access.
Okay, Yesai, Roman, those were all the questions. Thank you again for everyone joining. I know we did run over a little bit on time, but I think all the content was necessary for this to get packed in. So I hope we satisfied some of the concerns or address some of the major key considerations when making a move like this. Thank you all again for joining. Remember, Ravanty is a newly founded Microsoft partner who is ready to take on and help organizations deliver a more collaborative, more productive, and more secure experience for organizations everywhere. So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.